Hello, biology students. Let's get looking at two different types of cells we maybe never have heard of, prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. So these two structures look very different, right? One is pretty simple and one is pretty complicated, but they have some things in common with one another. And we're going to actually start there. What parts are in common? Well, they both have DNA. In this one, it's the stringy stuff, and that is the same thing as within this nucleus here. But there's actually no nucleus in the prokaryotic cell. They both have cytoplasm, which is this jelly-like substance around all of those crazy cell parts. And they both have the outer coating called the cell membrane. And they both are going to have these weird little dots that we're going to learn a lot about throughout this unit. I call them the freckles of the cell, called ribosomes. So there's only 4 things they have in common, and that's helpful because then that means almost everything else is different. Let's learn about those differences. And we're going to start by talking about one type at a time. Let's start with prokaryotic cells. And on your notes, you have a chart to put this information down. Prokaryotic cells have no nucleus. I like to remember this as pro, have, no. They also have no membrane-bound organelles. That means a lot of the organelles are actually missing from prokaryotic cells. They're simpler because they're missing so many organelles. We think then that that simplicity is because they evolved earlier. They're smaller and overall just simpler. So let's look at the image one more time. So we're going to now see the picture as much smaller. In reality, it's even smaller than that. And there's just not a lot going on in this prokaryotic cell. Versus this eukaryotic cell, so many different cell parts called organelles. And a lot of them have this outer coating, and that was the membrane-bound organelles. And we'll talk about that in a future set of notes. Now let's learn some examples of prokaryotic cells. One type is archaebacteria. Archae meaning ancient, meaning it's old. And not only is it old, they love the extreme. So old and extreme, meaning they like to live in places without any oxygen or that are super hot, such as hot springs. And sometimes they can even survive on space shuttles in space. Eubacteria, Eubacteria is known as true bacteria. They're the ones we know about the most, like strep, or other things that you probably can think of like anthrax. All right, so we'll learn a lot about these, so I'm leaving this or as ... We're going to talk about these throughout this class. There's also eukaryotic cells. Remember, these are the bigger, more complex ones, and one of the reasons why, as we will normally think mostly, they have a nucleus. So you are a eukaryote. Your cells have a nucleus. And not only that, you have the membrane-bound organelles, but the other ones don't. Those are a lot of the complex ones that we'll learn about in our next set of notes. They were more recent in evolution because they're more large, they're more complex, and mostly they're multicellular. There's a couple types that are unicellular. Now let's go over some examples. So keep in mind, now we're focusing on the eukaryotic ones. So one example would be for unicellular amoeba. These are single-celled eukaryotic cells. The reason why we know they're not bacteria is because they're larger. And not only that, they have a nucleus. Once we see there's a nucleus, we know for sure it has to be eukaryote and not a prokaryotic cell. Plants are eukaryotes. They all have nuclei or nucleus. Fungi are multicellular and also have a nucleus. And animals. So you are a eukaryote. You have a nucleus. Prokaryotes have no nucleus. We will practice this in class. Great job, guys.